Hello, I'm Bhagyashree Garekar, and you're listening to Asian Insider. We're recording this episode on Wednesday, October 22nd, days before President Trump lands in Asia. And I'm speaking to Ambassador Wendy Cutler, a seasoned American trade negotiator and now Senior Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Hi, Wendy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, as we speak, all eyes are on the Trump-Xi summit. And you've been involved in so many critical deals yourself, Wendy, as former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. And I'm hoping that you can give us a bit of an idea as to what happens before such high-stakes summits, important not just for these two countries, but for, I think, all of us across the world. So what goes on? How does the president typically prepare? Please enlighten us.
Well, I'd be glad to, but I'd have to also say that this administration's a little different than previous administrations in that the preparatory work was very much conducted at the working level during other administrations I served for. This time around, I sense that the president himself likes to be more involved, not only in the substance, but also in kind of the arrangements and deciding who at the end of the day he's going to meet with. So just for your listeners, just to kind of put that caveat on the table. But I think it's fair to say that particularly for those countries that are looking to meet with President Trump, they are working hard to conclude trade agreements that can be signed and announced during his visit to Asia. Negotiations have been underway with a whole range of countries all over Asia for the past 8 months. And while some have been concluded, many of the important ones, including with ASEAN countries and with Korea, have not been finalized yet. So that will be a major focus. Also, getting ready for the Xi-Trump meeting is going to be extremely important, again, both with respect to substance, but to also all of the logistics and the agenda regarding such a possible meeting. I always recall in the lead up to these meetings, while I wanted to focus on substance and try and finalizing the agreements, a lot of this logistical stuff also becomes extremely important, including which issues are on the agenda and are not on the agenda. So I expect we're going to see a lot more activity at the working level, at the cabinet level, and ultimately meetings in the White House and the equivalent of the White House all over Asia as countries try and finalize some deals.
Now, Wendy, you're pretty sure this meeting is going to happen? There's still a sense of will they, won't they meet?
Oh, between Xi and Trump. Yeah. Look, my sense is they are going to meet, absence like some other new development which totally derails the relationship. Secretary Besson has been on the phone with his counterpart, Lynda Hong, just a couple of days ago. And my understanding is they'll be meeting this weekend. Now, that meeting, in my mind, will be pivotal to the decision on whether to go ahead with a Trump-Xi meeting. Because if it looks like that there's no meeting of the minds, I think the risks would be extremely high for the two leaders to get together with no positive outcome. And I think both sides would want to avoid that. That said, I always look at the prospects of these meetings as important action-forcing events. And so, ministers who are charged with preparing for the meeting are also trying very hard, if possible, to come up with some deliverables then that can be announced by the leaders. So I'm optimistic on the prospect of a meeting, but I think both sides, they don't want to, to confirm that yet, because I think they're using the prospects of a meeting as leverage at the negotiating table.
Right. So first, the two sides have to meet. Treasury Secretary and Vice Premier from the Chinese side have to have a good meeting, and they have to be good deliverables that can be sort of announced by the presidents. Okay, presuming that goes ahead, what concrete things do you imagine are going to be on the table What will they shake their hands over?
Right. So, look, there's tariff hikes that need to be discussed and whether to continue the tariff pause, the 90-day tariff pause. But also remember, on the tables in November 1, 100% tariff threat by Trump. That will need to be on the table. Export control threats by China on critical minerals will be on the table, I'm sure. And the president has also mentioned soybeans and fentanyl as issues to be on the table. But unlike the negotiations between China and the U.S. during Trump's first term, this time around, China's being extremely assertive. And for any concession that Beijing makes to Washington, I think it is extremely clear that they're going to expect something in return. And that's where this discussion is going to get, I think, somewhat tense in terms of what the U.S. is willing and prepared to give China in return for the important concessions that we are seeking.
So what might China want? What might be the top, maybe one or two items that China must have out of this meeting?
So number one, I think they would want a rollback of tariffs, particularly of the 100% threat, but also some kind of certainty that this 90-day pause period will continue, hopefully for longer than 90 days. So in other words, freeze the tariffs in that 30% for China, 55% for the U.S. for the foreseeable future. But second, and I think that as the tariff part of these discussions become less important, I think it's going to be the export controls and export restrictions, because China has discovered that in mirroring the U.S. export control law, it can now effectively regulate the export of critical minerals and magnets, which are critical inputs for so many sectors in the U.S. and the global economy. And so China, in return, will want the U.S. to either relax or to promise to a standstill on export controls with respect to products like software or advanced semiconductors. And these are going to be very difficult areas for the U.S. to move on. So we'll have to see whether some kind of bargain can be achieved. My gut feeling is that both sides will announce a delay in all of these measures and then point to continued discussions between Bessent and his counterpart. And then the question for me, and I'll be looking very closely to see if and when the two leaders meet, do they actually announce a visit by the president to China, which could then become the next action-forcing event for actual deliverables to be achieved beyond some kind of delay or standstill.
So it sounds like both countries are not willing to give up their leverage, whether it's on AI chips on one hand and on rare earths on the other. And then you're going to see some version of kicking the football down and making some room for the trade to continue then. Okay. Now, if it doesn't happen in the worst situation, do you think it might come to the case that you would have US impose 157% tariffs on Chinese goods, which is what Mr. Trump, I heard him say that just yesterday.
Well, look, again, in the lead up to negotiations, no one wants to show that they're weakening on their threats. But China is watching this very closely, and Beijing recognizes that the last time the president actually put in place tariffs of that magnitude, he had to quickly back down, not because of China, but because of own domestic economic pressures, and specifically the movement, the negative movement in the bond and the stock market. And this time around, it's even more risky in that there's so many high tariffs in place now between the U.S. and other trading partners, unlike the last time we imposed those very high tariffs on China. So again, I don't think Beijing is taking that 100% threat as seriously as it would have 6 months ago. I'm not saying it's not taking it seriously at all, because our president, one thing everyone's learned, he's unpredictable. And he may just go ahead and do that and say that, we haven't gotten what we want, and this is what I'm doing, and, we'll deal with the domestic economic consequences.
Wow. So we're watching this very high stakes and very powerful pairs on both sides just kind of um, duel it out, at least somewhat in public. So it's just fascinating. And now, of course, it's been since Mr. Trump was sworn in, every day I think he's talked about a trade deal. And Wendy, you've analyzed so many for us in here at the Straits Times as well. So I was wondering, what do you give him, an A for? Which of his trade deals gets an A from you?
Mm-hmm. So overall, as a trade negotiator, I look at these deals, and my view is they're vague, and they're not detailed, they're not rules based, and so in my view, it's going to make it more difficult to implement because I'm not sure both sides have the same understanding in terms of what they've actually agreed to. So as a trade negotiator, I can't give any of these deals an A.
Oh.
Where I do commend the president is that through his threats, whether the world likes it or not, and through his unpredictability and his, threat also to not only retaliate trade for trade, but actually, if trade agreements aren't reached, he hasn't taken off the table, taking other measures against countries, including in the security or the political or people-to-people area. Through all this, he's been able to get countries to make major trade concessions to the United States without giving very much in return. Now, when I talk to our trading partners, their view is that they really had no choice but to do this. But I think that they also feel that maybe these agreements are not as durable as previous agreements they've reached with the United States. That for the time being, if they can lower the temperature, then that's important. But I don't think any of our trading partners think by signing these deals with Trump that, it'll be smooth sailing for the next 3.5 years.
Right. And speaking of that, Singapore as a free trade partner definitely had that expectation. I think there was that shock when the 10% tariffs came through. Although, of course, we are aware that this is as low as it gets, and I don't know, as good as it gets.
Well, exactly. And I think not only Singapore, but our other FTA partners, I think, went into this exercise thinking that they have, a legally binding agreement with the United States. And so therefore they would be treated specially or in a preferential manner. In reality, I would argue they were almost penalized in the negotiating process because they had less to give. Their tariffs are already at zero. And so unlike in India or the EU, which could add tariff reductions to the pot to make deals more attractive for Trump, FTA partners had to really look elsewhere to make concessions. So again, I don't think Singapore's alone here, but frankly, I think they probably got the best deal that anyone's gotten, and that is, a 10% reciprocal tariff from the United States.
Yeah, well, that is good to hear.
But it's a new world. It's a new world. And if you had told me 8 months ago this is where we would end up, I would have told you that our trading partners would never put up with this. But again, I'd give the president an A for somehow working with our trading partners to pull this off.
Right. Now, as Mr. Trump travels through Asia, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, and I believe he's also meeting Indian Prime Minister Modi on the sidelines. What else can we expect by way of significant changes in trade deals, or some of the trade deals that are in the works, not yet announced, or I guess in the case of Japan, it might be that they want to clarify certain aspects. So, what are you looking to see? What else apart from, of course, the all-consuming U.S.-China deal?
Right, and so the agreements that I'm really watching to see if they are finalized is an agreement with Korea. Korea being the the host of Apec this year. I think the leaders' meeting between President Lee and President Trump is going to be an important action-forcing event for that trade agreement to be reached. And if it's not reached, particularly with Korea, then I think both sides lose momentum. So I am, this isn't going to be easy. And I know the negotiations have been very intensive leading up to, the meetings next week. But I am cautiously optimistic that some kind of deal will be reached. I'm also closely watching whether agreements are announced between the U.S. and Malaysia, the U.S. and Cambodia, and the U.S. And Indonesia, and whether, I don't think a deal will be reached with India, but if there is a bilateral leader-to-leader meeting, what are the signals? Do the two sides signal progress, not only on the trade front, but also with respect to the India purchases of Russian oil? And so that will be a very important meeting to watch. In terms of the actual agreements, it will be interesting, number one, to see what is the outcome of the negotiation between the U.S. and Korea on a $350 billion investment fund. This has been the sticking point in the talks to date. With respect to the ASEAN countries, I think it's going to be important to see what type of economic security provisions are included in these deals and how they are interpreted by China, whether China views some of these provisions as maybe anti-China. So I think that will be important to watch. And the other thing I'll be watching very closely is there any reference to how this 40% transshipment tariff is going to be applied? Because that could have a great impact on the applicability of any low reciprocal tariff to U.S. individual ASEAN member trade. And so that will also be important to look at. And finally, in the ASEAN and the Korean deals will be an important area to watch. Will there be any special treatment for these countries with respect to certain Section 232 sectoral tariffs? So we've seen that in deals with Japan and the EU. But for example, will Malaysia get some type of lower tariff or exception from the semiconductor tariff that might be announced soon under the 232 investigation? Will Vietnam get anything on wood, and so forth? Singapore on pharmaceuticals. Yeah. That's all going to be very important to watch because a lot of U.S. trade with ASEAN countries is in the sectors that are targets of the Section 232 investigations.
Right. So it sounds like plenty of news, breaking news, starting from the weekend and all the way through next week. Now, in Southeast Asia, we're always in, a trade frame of mind. We are so dependent, our economies depend on trade, as you know. I wonder if you might look ahead to next year for us. Is that going to be a better year for trade, or as long as you can see? No, when does the good season start?
When does the good season start? So I hate to break the news to your viewers, but my personal view is we're going to be living in a tariff world for the next 3.5 years. Now, once deals are in place on the reciprocal tariffs, maybe things will quiet down for a while. But with the multitude of Section 232 announcements and potential tariffs being announced, I think that is something to watch, to watch closely and could really impact a lot of trade between U.S. and ASEAN countries. So that's number one. Also, let's remember, these agreements do not have traditional dispute settlement mechanisms. And frankly, the way I read them, the U.S. will be the decider in terms of whether countries are living up to the commitments the U.S. thinks that they reach with these countries. And so that leads me to the conclusion that countries are going to be on edge for the next 3.5 years because the U.S. can decide, well, wait a second, this country promised to purchase $10 billion of U.S. airplanes and that sale has not gotten through. We're going to threaten or put in place tariffs. And let's keep in mind, too, that the president is not shy in issuing tariff threats with respect to measures that are completely out of the trade realm, whether it be, who the political leaders are or some development in the country, or where they're are they buying Russian oil or not. So there's just a lot of unpredictability in the next 3.5 years. That said, we all hope that things calm down a bit, because companies have to make decisions on how to adjust their supply chains in this world. And without more certainty, I'm hearing from a lot of companies they're putting off these decisions, which is going to impact not only US economic growth, but global economic growth.
Absolutely. Um, the other thing for Southeast Asia is that China is our biggest trading partner, our biggest investment partner as well, for many countries. Now, one thing with China and the economic model that they have, they do produce a lot of goods and a lot of EVs and many other things, from garments to, um, a lot of them just come down to Southeast Asia. It's part of, I guess, China wanting all its goods, its inventories cleared, and they also have the RCEP, the Regional Free Trade Agreement. So through that, I think China also has good access to the ASEAN market. Now, the flip side of it is, some of it, because so many finished goods come down through that line, our own industries tend to suffer a little bit, right? We've seen that happen in the garment industry in Indonesia and elsewhere as well. What do you think would be a good way out of this kind of scenario? I mean, these nations want to keep a good thing going with China, but on the other hand, well, how do you say no?
Well, exactly. And countries are now trying to balance the pressures from their own domestic industries
Yes.
with their relationship with China. And that's very difficult to navigate. But look, my sense is that at the end of the day, leaders are elected based on what based on their track record in defending and promoting domestic interests. So I am not surprised, as many ASEAN countries now more and more are imposing anti-dumping duties on Chinese imports, low-priced, unfairly traded Chinese imports. And I expect we're going to see more use of these kind of tools to keep these Chinese goods out. Ultimately, to be successful, and given that this Chinese export of manufactured excess capacity is impacting countries all around the world, not just in ASEAN, I really believe that the way to deal with this is a collective response. And even discussing a collective high tariff in certain sectors against Chinese imports. And maybe steel is the first sector, and where a lot of work has been done here in the past, but countries have not been willing to go that far. But I wonder if we're getting into a world where there's going to be more willingness on the behalf of countries all around the world to kind of band together and to tell China, we cannot absorb these exports. And when you look at Chinese growth figures, I mean, it's no secret that's where their growth is coming from. It's these exports, which are, valued at very cheap prices, and frankly, driving out competition in countries all around the world. The US, we're not shy right now about putting on those high tariffs against Chinese imports. President Biden put into effect a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and other products of concern. And, the Trump tariffs are being stacked on those tariffs. So again, I think, other countries really need to think very carefully about, what's the risk if they don't now take action? Because the one thing on trade action, if you take it too late in the process, you've already lost those companies. You've already lost that industrial base. And so, my view is, as we see signs of this, it's really in in our collective interests to take collective responses.
Right. One way or one big event where that might happen, I guess, is APEC that's coming up, and which President Trump, as far as we know, is not attending. Do you think APEC remains I mean, so much action is bilateral. So does it remain a viable organization, or is it like sunset for APEC now?
Yeah. A great question. I spent a lot of my career working on APEC, so I'm on the side of I think it remains a useful organization, but clearly it's experiencing challenges, and those challenges have been underway now for a number of years. But even with the different, when you look at the membership with China, the US, and Japan, and others in this organization, it's still able to promote, I would call, practical deliverables that are helping traders trade around the world. And it's really a forum for discussion on emerging issues, even if conclusions are not reached. So I continue to see the utility in APEC. Maybe, again, you mentioned, and that's my understanding, while the president's going to go to Korea and will attend the CEO summit that's part of, the APEC week, he's going to stay away from the APEC leaders meeting. When many people think of APEC, they only think of the leaders meeting, but in reality, there are lots of meetings, and maybe too many meetings going on through the year, kind of, teeing up some deliverables. So look, I think it is important, but like every international organization, these organizations continue, it's imperative that they move with the times, that they find ways to become more relevant, and they find kind of their secret sauce and what's their value added. And I continue to believe that APEC does provide value added.
Right. And that brings us to, it's a nice wrap for the conversation we've had. Thank you very much, Wendy, for sharing so many insights with us. And along with you, we'll be watching what happens next, and hopefully we can talk more about what is to come.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Asian Insider. I'm Bhagyashree Garekar. And if you liked what you heard, please share this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Thank you for listening.